First of all, thank you for being here on Labor Day, our extended weekend to come join us. We love having you guys here. We are in a series right now that we're calling Engage, and we're really looking at how to move from just being engaged, meaning having your toes kind of dipped in the water, to being what we're calling fully engaged. I can tell you, I've been a pastor for a long time, for 20-something years now, and I have walked with people, a lot of people right toward the end of their lives. I have never had a single person tell me, I wish I wouldn't have been fully engaged with Jesus. I've never had a single person express regret for giving their life completely and totally to Him. And so that's what we're looking at. How can we move from just being kind of engaged to being fully engaged with God and the things that He's doing here at Trailhead? When I was a kid, I was in elementary school. I took piano lessons, and if I were to go sit down in front of this keyboard and try to play something today, you would have no idea in the world that I ever took piano lessons, right? But I took 5 years of piano from my grandmother, and that was part of the problem right there. She was a phenomenal piano player. And she taught students, she taught hundreds of different students and did great things with them. But she made a decision when she started teaching me and my sisters. So my sisters were about the same age as me. We would go over to her house every Monday, and she made a decision that she cared more about being a grandmother than she cared about being our teacher, right? So she wasn't nearly as hard on us as she was on most of her students. I didn't practice nearly the way that I should have. And as a result of that, what happened was that at the end of every year, we would come together and do a recital. And so I would have to play, a handful of songs that I had been learning throughout the year. And all the aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody would be there for this recital, And my grandmother would give us a certificate, like a certificate of completion. So the first year I got a certificate that says John has completed 1 year of piano. The second year, John has completed 2 years of piano. And then somewhere in the third year, I think it finally hit my grandmother that I was really kind of giving her a bad name as a teacher, and she didn't want people to know how long I had been taking piano from her. And so every certificate after that just says, John has completed another year of piano, right? Because I was a little bit of an embarrassment to her as a teacher. And so I look back at that and realize, you know what? I was engaged because I learned things. I learned middle C. I learned how to read music. I learned some chords. But I was not fully engaged by any means. Because that's, again, basically all I remember to this day. I just didn't practice the way that I should, didn't learn the things that I should have in that time. So I was engaged, but not fully engaged. And then years later, I ended up in California and met a guy out there who had some physical disabilities. So he had a lot of challenges that I don't face, but he was an incredible pianist. He would play the piano and he put everything into it. I mean, he went ahead and got a master's degree in performance, piano performance, and I went to his recital that was right toward the end of his time, his graduation there. And I mean, this guy played for like an hour, all of these incredible classical pieces, and I'm sitting there listening, and I was just thinking, I should have been fully engaged. I should have paid attention. I should have actually done that, because I would love to be able to play the piano today. But I was never fully engaged. I think you know how this works. This is something that all of us choose all throughout life. We can just dip our toes in and kind of get into something, or we can go all in. You can do that here at Trailhead. You can do that with God. You can come and you can listen to messages, and you can sing the songs and really never go beyond that, or you can go all in and be fully engaged with God. And so that's what we're looking at. How do we go from the place where we're just kind of engaged to the place where we're fully engaged with the things that God is doing here at Trailhead? As we have talked about this over the last couple of weeks now, I introduced you last week to these icons that are hopefully going to help you remember what we've been talking about. So if you were here last weekend, does anybody remember what that first icon represents? Gather. I saw one person say it. Thank you, John. So I know some of you know that, just don't want to say it out loud, right? Gather. That's what we talked about last week. And so we kind of said, if we want to move from being engaged to fully engaged, the first step is making a commitment, a long-term commitment to gathering with the church of Christ when the church is together. And we looked at some words of Jesus from the book of Matthew as to why gathering is so important last weekend. This weekend, we're moving on to the second icon. Anybody have a guess as to what that icon, this icon may represent for us today? Grow. I heard somebody say it, grow. Yeah, grow. So, the vine, the leaves, the whole idea there is that if you want to fully engage with God, a second thing that you need to do is have a plan for growing spiritually. And so today, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about developing a clear plan or a clear pathway to move to the places where God wants us to move to in terms of our spiritual life. And as I was thinking about that this week, one thing that is kind of an illustration of how this works is the idea of swimming lessons. When our kids, we've got 3 girls, if you haven't met my family, we've got 3 girls, and when they were a little bit younger, we obviously just failed as parents in being teachers in terms of swimming, right? So we tried and they didn't get it, and we tried and they didn't get it. So we finally said, okay, we're just going to pay somebody to teach them how to swim, right? So we took them to the YMCA, we took them to a person who's a lifeguard, and they taught them really 2 different things in terms of swimming. So the whole first part of their classes was devoted to just keeping their head above water. So they taught them how to float. You lay on your back and relax. And some people float. I just sink like a rock. I don't know why that is, but I cannot float. But they would teach you how to float. If you didn't do well floating, or even if you did, they would take you to the next step of floating, which if you fell in the water or whatever, they wanted you to know how to keep your head above water. So they taught them how to tread water, how to just stay where you are, kick your legs, move your arms, so that you can at least keep your head above water. That's the first stage in learning how to swim. And then the second thing that they taught them later on was, freestyle. They taught them how to use their arms and kick their legs. And in that, you didn't just stay where you were, you got to move from point A to point B. And what that meant for our kids, which they were really excited about, was they got to move from the shallow end to the deep end, where the big kids were, right? So they got to move, they got to experience some growth in terms of what they were doing. Here's the reason I tell you that. In churches, I think especially in America, in the United States, we have done a pretty decent job of telling people, you need to follow Jesus, you need to be a Jesus follower. And a lot of people have followed the pool and they've been baptized and all of that. But basically they spend the rest of their lives just figuring out, okay, how do I tread water? Right? I don't want to sink, because that would not be good spiritually. So they just tread water for the rest of their lives. And what God, I believe, is saying to us is He's saying, if you want to be fully engaged with me, you have to move from this point of just, okay, I can keep my head above water, to moving with me, moving from point A to point B. God wants us to grow in Him and with Him. And that's what Jesus is going to show us in the passage that we're looking at today in Luke chapter 14. He's actually going to start to show us what it means to have a plan to grow spiritually, and hopefully give us some of what spiritual growth is, because that's kind of this nebulous out there thing, right? I mean, what does it mean to grow spiritually? How do you know if you're growing? How do you know if you're not? All of that kind of stuff. So Luke chapter 14 is where we're going to hang out for a few minutes. And I have to tell you, if you're new to the church, if you're new to the Bible, this is one of those passages you may initially read this and think, I don't know that I like this Jesus guy anymore, because the things that he says sound really harsh up front. But just hang with me, because we're going to talk about why he's saying the things that he's saying, all right? So Luke chapter 14, he gives us this idea of what it means to grow spiritually, starting in verse 25. It says this: large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, And here's the part that may make you cringe. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Like I said, this is one of those things, it seems so counter to everything else that Jesus says, right? There are points where we talk about often where Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. He tells us to love people well, to love them extensively, and then we come to this place where he's talking about spiritual growth, and he says, but I want you to hate your family. And it's like, what in the world are you doing, Jesus? This is so opposite of everything that you say. And you know what? If you go into the Greek and study the Greek and with the hopes of, oh, he didn't really mean that, it got interpreted the wrong way. No, he meant what he said. And he may be exaggerating a little bit here, but he means what he's saying when he says, hate your father and mother, your wife and children, your sisters and brothers. And so what do we do with that? How do we process that and interpret that? I think the first thing that you need to know is he doesn't mean literally, physically hate and be abusive toward your family, right? And part of the way that you can figure that out is he says that you have to hate your own life, right? And so I don't think he's saying you need to be abusive to yourself. You need to tear yourself down in front of people and just hate yourself if you're going to follow me. I don't think that's what he's doing here. But he's using strong language. He's using pointed language. And what I believe he's doing is he's setting up a list, essentially, of priorities. Let me demonstrate to you what I think he is doing here. So you're going to see him do this a few times in this passage. But what I think Jesus is doing is he's saying, for some of us, we have a list of priorities, and number one on our list of priorities is people. And that doesn't sound like a bad thing, right? Number one would be relationships. That's the top priority for a lot of people. So I think if Jesus were to extend this out and to say it a little bit different way, or to speak to us further about what he's saying, I think he may ask us questions like this. If you're a grandparent, you know what it means to want to move close to your grandkids, to be close to family, right? There are a lot of people that have moved into northern Colorado because they had grandkids here, family here. What if you're in that situation where you say, I want to move toward my grandkids, but God comes to you and says, I have something different planned for you. And it's not going to take you toward your grandkids, it's going to take you away from your grandkids. Which one of those things is going to get priority? Which one of those things are you going to actually carry out and live out? If you're in a dating relationship, same type of scenario, right? If you've been with someone and you think this may be the one, this may be the person that I should be with, what if God comes to you and says, I want you to just trust me in this. This is not going to take you toward that person, though. This is going to take you away from them. What do? Who gets priority in that case? If you have kids, and maybe this is the hardest one of all. If you have kids and they are engaged in certain things and they love what they're doing, they're engaged in a certain sport and they love that sport, but it's starting to come in conflict with what God is telling you to do. Do you invest fully in what your child is doing in that sport, or do you say, you know what, that can't be our top priority, we want you to do this and we're going to support you, but God is telling us to do this. In the meantime, what takes priority there? If you have a school that you love because they give incredible opportunities to your child, but God says, I don't want your child there, I want them in a different place, what takes priority? That's the question that Jesus is asking here. For a lot of people, our top priority in life is people, it's relationships, but not everyone has relationships as their top priority. And so Jesus goes on and he gives us another example, so to speak, in verse 27. He says this. He says, anyone who does not carry his cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. You may have heard that before, even if you haven't been around the church a whole lot. Think about the context of what he's saying. First century Israel, it was under Roman occupation, right? And the way that the Romans punished people and killed people for things that they did was typically through crucifixion. But before they would crucify somebody, you know what they would do with them? They would take this person and they would put that cross essentially on their shoulders, and they would make them haul that cross through town as a way to humiliate them. Right? And so what Jesus is saying here is he's saying, if you're not willing to endure some humiliation on my behalf, you may not be ready to follow me. So the second thing that he's saying is, I believe he's saying where some people's top priority is people and relationships, other people, their top priority is pride or ego, right? And I think he's saying to us, again, if you've had a dream your whole life, and this is what you've always wanted to do, and I come to you and say, I know this is your dream, but you should really consider this other thing in your life. What's going to take priority? If God comes to you and says, I want you to be a part of this mission, and yeah, because you do this, people are going to look down on you and your friends may make fun of you, but I want you to be a part of this. Well, at that point, does your pride take priority, or does your relationship with God take priority? What Jesus says both times here is he says, if these things take priority, if relationships, if ego become the number one thing in your life, you know what? You're probably just going to tread water. You're not ready to grow yet. You are not ready to be my disciple. Jumping down, there's one more that he lists here. I want us to jump down to verse 33, and then we'll come back and look at everything in the middle. But verse 33 says this, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Do you know what he's talking about in that context? He's talking about people whose priority maybe isn't relationship, maybe it isn't ego, but their priority in life is possessions. And I think all of us can relate to this to some degree. You know, we work to get the house that we want. Maybe you're the kind of man that you like to restore cars or build cars, and you've worked on this car, and it's something that's your pride and joy. And Jesus looks at you and says, okay, what's priority here? Or maybe it's a savings account. I know it's getting really close to home to talk about. Maybe it's a savings account that you have worked and you put things aside for so long because you have a dream of going and doing something. Or a retirement account that you've been faithfully putting money away in this retirement account. What happens when God comes to you and says, I know you have worked hard, you have been faithfully storing things away, but I want you to take this and use it for your neighbor. And I want you to trust that I am the God who gave you the ability to build up that account, and I am the God who will continue to take care of you and give you the ability to rebuild that account. What do you do in that moment when God comes to you and says, your possessions, I want you to give them away? It's a question of priorities. And Jesus is just going through this litany of items here where he's saying, if you really want to follow, if you really want to grow in your faith, you cannot do it as long as these things are in first place in your life. And so basically everything that he's saying here is he's saying, if you really want to grow, if you really want to create a plan to step into growing and be, what you have to start with is moving whatever it is that's number one to number two, so that your number one thing in life, your number one priority, and all that you pursue and all that you do is Jesus. If you want a definition of what spiritual growth is, because like I said, it's kind of just this out there, how do you know if you're growing or not. How do you know if this is the right thing or not? Here's what I think Jesus is saying. I think he's saying, here's what spiritual growth is all about. It's about moving toward absolute surrender to Christ. It's about moving toward the place where everything else is prioritized underneath the lordship of Jesus Christ. That's what spiritual growth is. And so Jesus kind of lays that out for us, but then in the verses in between, those verses that we skipped, he starts to tell us how this works. He tells us two stories, actually, that give us an indication of how we're supposed to go about this. So if we back up to verse 28 again, listen to what Jesus says. The first story he tells is this. He says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Will you not first sit down and estimate the cost to see if he has enough money to complete it? Let me ask you a question. What is this guy doing when he is sitting down and creating a budget, estimating the cost? You know what I think he's doing? He's creating a plan. He's creating a pathway. He's looking at his resources. He's saying, what do I have and what do I need in order to get where I want to be, right? He's sitting down. He's thinking about a plan. He's thinking about the process, okay? And Jesus says this. He says, for if he lays the foundation and is not able to finish it, everyone who sees him will ridicule him, saying, this fellow began to build and was not able to finish. So the first illustration that he gives us, the first story he gives us to tell us how to step in. If you want to prioritize Jesus as the key thing in your life, if you really want to grow spiritually, he says you need a plan. He sits down and he creates a pathway to get from here to there, right? He's not just treading water anymore. He's going from point A to point B. That's the whole idea. He tells a second story that's almost exactly the same thing. He says this, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Will he not first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Again, do you see what he's saying through the story? He's saying, if you want to understand how to grow spiritually, it's kind of like this. It's kind of like you know that God is coming. You know that his way is stronger than your way. He's got 20,000 men. You got 10,000 men, right? So you know that he has got more resources than you do. You have to sit down and decide, okay, so do I want to continue to do it my way? Or am I going to surrender to the king who's coming and trust that he will be a king that takes care of the things that I need? In order to get there, one way or the other, though, it says he sits down and considers how this works. He sits down, he creates a plan, he creates a pathway, or creates a process for getting there. So over and over in this section of Scripture, what Jesus is doing is he's saying, here's what spiritual growth is. It is having a pathway, a clear plan for where you're going, and it is having a clear plan that is moving toward absolute surrender. If we were to boil all of that down or put it into one statement, one nutshell kind of statement, again, I think what Jesus is saying is he's saying that spiritual growth is equal to complete surrender, a plan or an action of complete surrender, right? In this passage, if we look at the last couple of verses, the last thing that Jesus says is pretty interesting. So actually in verse 33, we read this earlier, but he said, in the same way, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. Again, you need to have a plan of surrender, right? And then verses 34 and 35, he says this, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? If you're anything like me, you read this and like, wait a minute, I thought we were talking about spiritual growth or maybe kings or something, but what is he talking about with this whole salt thing, right? Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It It's fit neither from soil nor from the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears, let him hear. So what is Jesus saying as he wraps this up? You know what I think he's saying? I think he's saying, if you want to know what the one thing is that makes you flavorful, if you want to know what your one distinctive is in the world, it is absolute surrender to God. That is what makes you as a believer distinctive. That is what gives you your saltiness in the world. That is what the world looks at and says we need. Because if you're just like everybody else, you just fit in with everything else, right? You have nothing distinctive. But when you surrender completely to God, that is what makes you distinctive. So again, what Jesus is saying is he is saying spiritual growth equals a plan to actively surrender things to God. Surrender everything to God. That's the whole point. And maybe a better way of thinking about it is it's a plan to move toward absolute surrender. Chances are you're not, I'm not, none of us are going to just one day step up and, okay, I give you everything, God. I don't even know what that means or how to do it, right? But we take steps toward that. And those steps are growth. Those steps are the plan for becoming what God wants you to become. Here's the good news. With all of that said, the good news is you don't actually have to go home today and sit down and create a plan or a pathway for growth. That's the good news. And here's why. Okay? Because about 3 years ago, before we ever started as a church, one of the things that we did was we sat down and we created what we called a discipleship process. But basically what it is it's a clear pathway for spiritual growth. At Trailhead, we call that pathway our growth trails. Okay? And so if you haven't been with us previously, or if you haven't heard this in a while, let me just remind you of what this pathway looks like, what the plan for spiritual growth looks like at Trailhead. The first part is what we call our starter trail. That doesn't mean you're starting in faith. That means that you're starting with Trailhead. Some of you have been through this. It's a 4-week group that meets right after the 11 o'clock service. We'll start another one in just a few weeks. I believe 3 weeks from now is when we start the next starter trail group. Okay? And that starter trail group asks the question, who is Trailhead? Is Trailhead the right place for you? Is this the place where you should be growing with God? Let me just throw in my 2 cents here, okay? I believe that this is a great place for you to begin growing with God. And we want you here. If you're wrestling through, is this the right place or not? I understand that, and I'm not trying to bias you too much. But I would love for you to grow with us at Trailhead. And the question that you should be asking, if you're looking to figure out, is this the place for me, is, do I see God at work around me here? Okay? Let me just remind you, because some of you guys know this, but this is stuff that blows my mind personally. Trailhead Church is 2.5 years old, and on any given weekend, we typically have 200 to 250 people that worship at our worship services. That's not normal, guys. If you're new to the whole church thing, I just want you to understand churches typically don't grow that fast, that quickly. And out of those 200 and 250 people that come, just a little over a month ago, we had 23 people, 23, many of whom were adults, that said, you know what, I want to follow Jesus and I want the world to know that I'm following Jesus. 23 people were baptized just a couple of months ago at Trailhead at our last baptism weekend. That is not normal in a church this size. It is not normal. God is doing incredible things. Even, if you just look at things that are on paper, organizational type things, I look at the fact that we are coming out of summer. We're coming out of a time where every church typically struggles to some degree in the summer because people are gone on vacation, people are spending their money on other things, and typically churches really go down financially during the summer and have to catch up through the rest of the year. As we come out of the summer, we are almost 100% exactly on budget for this year. That's not normal. God is doing things that are just absolutely amazing here. And so that's my encouragement to you. If you're still wrestling with, is this a place for me? Just open your eyes and look around and say, okay, where do I see God working? And if I see Him working here, I want to join Him. And the way that you start that pathway is what we call the starter trail. Like I said a minute ago, that answers the question, who are we as a church? The second step in the pathway is what we call the intermediate trail. The intermediate trail no longer asks the question, who is Trailhead? It asks the question, who are you? And it starts looking at the way that you're gifted. It starts looking at your passions. It starts looking at the way that God has wired you, and starts asking the question, okay, based on your gifts, based on your passions, how can you dive in? How can you get plugged in and start serving through the church? The third step in the process is what we call the advanced trail. The advanced trail is really that week after week group that meets. It's groups that get together that are continually asking the question, what do we need to do to become more like Christ in the way that we live? And so it's just a consistent, steady drip, week after week. It's being surrounded by a group of 8 to 10 other people that love you, that are friends of yours, that want to walk with you and grow with you, right? And finally, we have what we call the extreme trail, and that's kind of the last stage in our growth plan here. And the extreme trail is a trail where we actually read through the Bible together in a year's period of time. We meet on a weekly basis. And at that point, we're really beginning to ask the question, how can we take every thought captive to Christ? How can we take every thought that we have and filter it through the lens of Scripture so that we live this out day after day after day according to the ways of Jesus? So the good news is the pathway is there. The plan is there. It has clear steps, one place to the next. You don't have to sit down and create your own. You totally can create your own. But you don't have to. Here's the truth, though. If you want to move from being just engaged to being fully engaged with Christ, first step is that you have to have a commitment to regularly engaging and gathering with the church. The second step that we've been talking about this week is that you have to come to a point where you decide on and start living out a clear plan for prioritizing Jesus above everything else in life. Here's the real question, okay? And this is a question I can't answer for you. This is a question only you can answer. And it's listed up here above the step number 2. Do you really want this? Do you really want to be fully engaged with what God is doing? And specifically, do you really want to be fully engaged with what God is doing at Trailhead? I can tell you, whether it's at Trailhead or at another church, God wants you fully engaged with Him. And He wants you fully engaged with His church. This is the way He has created you to grow and to do life. Guys, it is so easy. Like we said at the beginning, it's so easy to get to the point where we tread water, where we just stay where we are, and we get really content with, okay, I can do this, I can tread water. But God says, I want you to move with me from the shallow and into the deep end, because there's so many things that you have not even begun to experience yet, that I want you to experience as you follow me. Will you make a commitment with me to grow in the way that God wants you and me to grow? Let's ask Him to help us with this. Father, we thank you so much that this is just the way that you created the entire world to work. That you create things that start with seeds, but you have a clear plan of where they need to go, how they need to be loved and cared for and treated in order to become plants that are producing fruit. And Father, in our lives, we want to do the same thing. We don't want to just tread water. We don't want to stay where we are. We want to grow in you. We want to know you and become all that you've created us to become. Help us, God, to become fully engaged with you. And all that that encompasses and all that that means, help us to become fully engaged with you and your plan for moving us from where we are to where you want us to be. We love you, Jesus, and we pray these things in the power of your name. Amen.